Hi there, everyone. This is this week's video on academic tone. So we will just start at the beginning. So academic tone may be something that some of you are already familiar with. If you've written research papers in the past or you've taken other writing classes, you may have used academic tone already in some of your writings. For some writers, this comes really naturally and feels pretty natural, especially if you're used to reading things like academic articles. Things that have a more formal journalistic tone can feature a lot of academic tone. So we'll walk through it together. Some of it may be review for you, but just bear with it. So just to begin with defining academic tone. So what is it exactly? Well, let's just kind of break it down and look first at that word tone. So when we talk about tone, what we're doing is referring to the writer's voice in a written work. So a lot of it is unread. A lot of it is something that the reader infers based on the vocabulary and the attitude and the way that the writer carries the words that they're putting to paper. So it's what the reader or the hearer might perceive as the writer's attitude, bias, or personality. So really a lot of tone is a projection of the reader's experience. So in a lot of ways, the writer has to be careful about the tone that they may project, especially if it's one that they don't intend. So that's what tone means. So when we put the word academic in front of it, a lot of people make the assumption that academic tone means that the language that we're going to be using is dull or boring, full of jargon, super complex sounding words, multisyllabic, intelligent sounding words that we're going to be right-clicking and replacing all the words that we can with more complex thesaurus versions of those same words. And that's really not true. Academic writing can be complex. It can also have great stylistic features. It can be engaging and clear at the same time that it's interesting and compelling for the reader. So don't make assumptions about academic tone being automatically boring or dull or unimaginative. There really is a lot of room and flexibility to move within academic tone, but there are some basic things that people need to keep in mind when they are writing using academic tone. Chief among them, speaking objectively. So when we approach research writing, we should be trying to project a voice that reflects that we are unbiased writers, that we're scholarly writers, and that what we say is suggested and supported by actual evidence, credible evidence, which is why we've spent so much time already in class looking at figuring out what are reputable sources, what are credible sources, what are unbiased sources, because that evidence reflects on our credibility as writers directly, specifically when we're using academic tone. So also, I like to use the Goldilocks approach to side with assertive phrasing in academic tone. So you don't want tenuous phrasing, but you certainly don't want aggressive phrasing. And we'll walk through this example on this slide to help sort of better illustrate what I mean by that. So a tenuous phrase would look something like the one that I've shared here. It is possible that perhaps the public sometimes overlooks important causes like supporting local animal shelters. So you can see where there's we're projecting a lot of hesitation as a writer. We're suggesting that maybe sometimes this is true. But if what we're doing is trying to get our readers to understand that this is a problem, we need to recognize that something is a problem, we need our readers to take some kind of action or change an attitude or adopt a belief, the tenuous phrasing is probably not likely to be as persuasive as we need to be. Also, it reflects on our own our tone that we're using can reflect a lack of confidence that we have ourselves as writers, which also makes us look less credible. So here's an alternative way that we could phrase it that's sort of right in the middle, and this is what I would call assertive phrasing, and this is a really positive approach to use for academic tone. It is easy for the public to overlook important causes like supporting local animal shelters. Okay, so we've lost a lot of the tenuous phrasing, that it is possible, perhaps, maybe, sometimes. We're moving away from a lot of those tenuous words. We're not overstating it, but we're using some assertion in our phrasing. It comes across the tone that we're using as a little more clear, a little more confident. So take note of the features of that assertive phrasing. Now we'll look at the problems of aggressive phrasing. So here's that example sentence. The public is disgraceful in its constant overlooking of important causes, like supporting local animal shelters. So here we can easily see how the reader can be alienated by aggressive phrasing, offended by aggressive phrasing. Aggressive phrasing can be overstated, exaggerated, a little bit dramatic, and that also can be really damaging to our credibility. And the more distance and dissonance that we create between ourselves, the writer, and our audience, the more difficult it is for us to be compelling and interesting and engaging and persuasive. And there really is a persuasive element even in informative research. So we always have an angle. We sometimes look to keep that under wraps more than we would for some writing occasions than others. But really we always want our audience to be taking something away, and there is a persuasive effort that's at work there. So the use of aggressive phrasing really is counterproductive to that end. Okay, so here's a simple list of things that we want to avoid when we are utilizing academic tone in our own writing. Some of this we've already walked through with the examples on the previous slide. So one of the first dangerous things that we do when we are moving out of academic tone is making broad generalizations. So words like always and never, it's really easy for your reader to find one specific instance that defies what you're saying. If you say people always do this, people never support that, all your reader has to do is find one instance where that's not the case, and now you're wrong, and that's affected your credibility, which also reflects on the quality of your academic tone. Another thing, over-sweeping objectives. So outstanding, obvious, those can sort of, they're really sneaky and they're really tricky, and they can creep into your writing really easily. Now, if you have a few of these that are featured in your writing and you've placed them carefully and intentionally, maybe it's not a deal breaker. But when a reader is going to see these over-sweeping adjectives all the time, you're sort of prosifying your writing, and that makes your writing less clear, less concise, and we get sort of that dramatic effect that you might have featured with aggressive phrasing. And dramatics is just really counterproductive to academic tone. So be careful of whether any kinds of oversweeping adjectives might be creating that sort of environment in your writing. Moving on, using lots of adverbs or qualifiers, really, clearly, a little, definitely. Those can be dangerous for academic tone. Then certainly emotional language. So it is heartbreaking that so many are starving. The emotional language in some ways may be apparent. Sometimes, particularly in academic tone, when you say these things directly to your reader, they may be thinking, well, yeah, duh. I gather that. I'm thinking that for myself. So really a lot of the power in academic tone is creating the phrasing and laying out the information that allows the reader to make that assessment for themselves. So you don't really have to come out and say that this is sad, this is heartbreaking, this is a social problem, this needs more attention, this needs more funding. Whatever it is that you're trying to convince your audience of, the emotional language that's direct kind of cheapens the effect of that. We want to give our readers the kind of credit that we want when we are reading, which is the credit of being intelligent and able to put two and two together, to read between the lines, to understand how ideas correlate. So we kind of ruin the surprise when we ourselves as writers introduce that emotional language. The effect of having a reader take in what we're saying and draw a conclusion that's important for themselves, it's sort of like giving a toddler two choices and they feel good about making the right choice. They get to share the credit. They get to enjoy having done the right thing, having been guided to the point where we expected them to be. Readers are the same way. They don't want to be spoon-fed things. People who read things that are published in academic journals certainly employ they certainly like to think for themselves. And so the emotional language sort of cheapens that academic tone. And then we also have the same thing for the same reasons carrying along with that inflammatory language. So again, we have examples on the last slide with aggressive phrasing, where we have things that are exaggerated, dramatic, inflammatory. Again, it just cheapens the effect that we can have on the reader. We want them to be able to draw their own conclusions. We want them to walk away having their own ideas and their own responses to what we've had to say, and connect those dots for themselves. The inflammatory language takes that right and experience away from them. Okay, so as we continue to wrap our heads around what academic tone is, I like this image of those shirts or those signs rather that you see when you walk into stores. Maybe it's a convenience store, maybe it's a discount store that you're going into, and it'll say something like no shirt, no shoes, no service. When we think about the phrases and the words that we're going to use in a research paper, we need to make sure that our words and our phrases are buttoned up. Are they wearing a shirt and shoes? Because they can't walk into the store without them. Are your words in the same way? Are they buttoned up enough to be included in your paper? Or are they walking around just a little too casual, not quite appropriate for this occasion of writing? So be thinking about that image as you are drafting your essay. Think about whether, if this word was a person, would this person be wearing flip-flops and board shorts, or would this person, this word as a person, be ready to go to church or ready to go visit grandma? You got to think about maybe personifying these words a little bit and thinking about how formal or informal they are, and as an extension of that, how appropriate those words are for the speaking occasion. So obvious to a lot of people, but you want to avoid the use of slang terms. Legit is something that I see a lot in research papers, and students are often surprised to learn that legit certainly could be used in its true form. Legit is a truncated word for legitimate, and certainly legitimate would fit in well for many occasions in academic writing, but legit is not. The word that I just cringe whenever I see it in academic writing and also in discussion posts, and I think really in most writing occasions, I hate seeing this word, so do many other English teachers, but nowadays, which is also not a word, and something that we might see, or rather hear a lot in speech. Maybe you would say this in conversation to someone, but that doesn't mean that it translates well to an occasion for writing, most especially academic writing. And then we have other slang terms like savage or beast, things that sort of pop culture has brought to us. And a lot of times these slang terms can be really confusing, because if you think of savage in the way that we defined the term 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, there's probably a lot of meaning that you're not attaching to that, or the reader isn't really understanding if they don't understand the specific context that you're using that word in. And you know what these slang terms are. You know when you're using them. So I would suggest just trying to find another way to phrase it without the use of slang. There's a lot of loaded language in there, and there's a lot of cultural specificity that can create confusion for your readers. And so avoiding slang terms is highly advisable. Another obvious point would be to abstain from abbreviated spellings, writing things in the way that you might text them. And just because it's a quicker or easier, more convenient way for the writer to convey a thought doesn't mean that that's appropriate for the occasion. So you are the greatest professor. Certainly you, the letter U in place of Y-O-U, or R in place of A-R-E. These things are not appropriate for really any kind of college level writing, most especially for any kind of research writing, academic writing at all. Cliches can sneak in easily to our writing, and so be on the lookout for those. But when we use cliches, we use phrases that have a culturally specific meaning. So if someone is reading your paper who has really no, maybe they don't speak English as a first language, and they read that you're saying something like the cat's out of the bag, they may think, well, why are we talking about a cat? Weren't we talking about something totally different? And so the cliche sort of has a specific audience that understands what that means. But it is culturally specific, and so it's not broad enough to be understood by your audience. It needs to be made more broad and more understandable to a greater audience. So cliches for that reason. And also there's probably a more original, fresh way to say what you mean to say. And so these things like cliches, we can rephrase them. We just need to challenge ourselves as writers to figure out, am I really saying what I mean to say? Or am I relying on a cliche because I kind of get what I'm trying to get across here, and I think that people generally get the gist of it. Don't settle for that. Make sure that your audience is really clear about what you mean to say, what you mean to demonstrate with your words. Finally, we have contractions. So when you're using apostrophes in academic writing, just before you do that, make sure that you are using the apostrophe to demonstrate ownership or possession of something, which is absolutely appropriate as far as ways to use an apostrophe. But if you're using it to bring two words together and to truncate the use of those two words, then I would rethink it. Words like wouldn't, could've, it's, we want to be careful about that. We cheapen the tone when we use these contractions. That gives the tone of our writing a less formal projection of ourselves. And so instead of saying wouldn't, we should say would not. Instead of saying could have, we should say could have. Instead of saying it's, we should say it is. It just helps to maintain that formal level of tone. Okay, so side by side, we have two paragraphs that are focused on very similar subjects, and we can see the difference between the formal and the informal expressions of these words. So here, just here, the informal version first. Once people started using the new budgeting app, they started saving stupid amounts of money. When I met with them to follow up on how they use the tool, most people said that using it was a piece of cake and that it was totally unbelievable. What a difference it's made in helping them to both maximize their income and increase their savings account deposits. Talk about killing two birds with one stone, am I right? Okay, so we've taken in the informal. You're probably seeing lots of red flags that we've already talked about on previous slides. So we're seeing cliches, culturally specific references, the two birds with one stone, the piece of cake, the use of totally unbelievable. When we started saving stupid amounts of money, we're using stupid with a specific and much more recently renovated context for the use of that word. So we can see how informal tone is really being projected by that writer. Now let's compare it with the more formal version that says pretty much the same thing, but uses more formal language and tone. So here we go. Participants demonstrated success in using a new budgeting program called Enterprise. In fact, in the first 3 months of using the program, participants reported a reduction in overall expenses by an average of $550 per month. Participants also discussed that using the program made them more motivated to save unused funds. 24% of participants reported increasing either the frequency or amount of monthly savings account deposits. So really we have the same kinds of information, but we've done a few things in the formal writing that really help us to bolster academic tone. And one of the things that really is also very helpful that we've done in formalizing this writing is the use of more specific information. Instead of saying that we have saved stupid amounts of money, we've helped people to save stupid amounts of money, we've actually quantified that and backed off using the word stupid in a way that doesn't actually literally mean stupid. We've quantified it as an average of $550 per month, because that's what your reader wants to know. When you say saving stupid amounts of money, well, how much is a stupid amount of money? What are we talking about? We've also given the specific name of this budgeting program, which is called Enterprise. Then in the informal paragraph or writing, we see that it's made a difference in helping them to both maximize their income and increase their savings account deposits. And again, your reader is going to be asking, well, how much? What is that difference? So here we have that quantified and accounted for in the formal writing. 24% of participants reported increasing either the frequency or amount of monthly savings account deposits. So again, we're being specific, we're being clear, we're also being concise. We're not exaggerating, we're not using culturally specific references, cliches, idioms, exaggerated language, trendy language, anything like that. You don't see that. If you saw this information 15 years in the future, people would still have an understanding of it. If you see this, the informal paragraph, it's going to kind of date itself. If we read it later, you can imagine that there might be phrases in here, like when we say stupid amounts of money. We're not likely to be using that word with the same weighted context as we do today. And so one of the benefits about academic tone is that it is a more timeless way to express yourself. People will understand this, and people will have a frame of reference for formal writing because it is clear, because it is concise, because it is specific in a way that they might not have with informal writing. So just keep in mind these two different examples. If you see yourself slipping into this more informal voice as you're drafting, you might anchor it and steer it back more toward this formal version. Okay, here are just two final pitfalls for using academic tone. One of the problems that I see when I'm looking at student drafts for their first attempts at research writing is that they write in the way that they speak. And I can see where that can creep into a draft easily. But remember that speaking and reading. So when we hear as a speaker, we expect some conversational tone. We expect some conversational language. There are things that you can do as you're speaking that you just can't get away with, or you can't convey your message as effectively if you use that same strategy when you're writing. So overall, conversational language is going to damage your credibility, and it can cause a lot of confusion for your reader. Remember that when we're speaking to one another, there's a lot of nonverbal language that helps to communicate our message and help people to understand what it is that we mean. We can't convey sarcasm, for example, as effectively in the written word as we can in speech. So remember, you lose some of these home court advantages with nonverbals. They just don't exist in writing. So we do have to be mindful of how clear and specific and concise we're being in order to maximize the impact of our audience when they are reading what we have to say. And then the second thing that can be a pitfall for using academic tone is the overuse of first-person perspective. So when we're writing, particularly as we're incorporating research into things that we have to say, discussing it in first person can cheapen our academic tone because it's really not necessary. We don't need to talk about it as though I am the reader. This is my perspective. So the use of I or we or you really does draw off of the formality of your writing. And so there are really simple ways to rephrase a lot of things so that they don't look as opinionated. The use of first person can make you look biased. And we talked about that at the very beginning, that when we establish academic tone, one of the goals is to be unbiased in the way that we come across to our readers. So backing off of that first person perspective use, it doesn't mean that it's never appropriate, but it means that whenever possible, if you don't need to use first person perspective, don't. Generally, if there's a good option to work around that, do that. Because really the objective of your writing, especially if you're utilizing academic tone, it probably isn't to discuss your personal thoughts or your experiences. This is a formal academic writing. So the way that you think and feel, this isn't a 5th grade book report. You're being analytical, you're being critical, and usually we can avoid using the first person perspective when these are our writing objectives. So these are just things to think about. So if you still have questions or you want more background reading on academic tone, pages 177 through 180 in the Little Brown Handbook, those pages are coming from, I think, chapter 7. Yeah, and you've read chapter 6 and 7 for this week. So those pages will be helpful to refer to if you still have questions or you want a little bit more information about academic tone. As always, you can let me know if you have any questions. And for the VVQ this week, your code word is caterpillar, CATERPILLAR. Caterpillar is your word. And again, let me know if you have any questions about the presentation, if you have any struggles as you are transitioning or formalizing your writing and adapting it for a formal audience, the use of academic tone. Just let me know if you have questions. Thank you for watching this video, and I will catch you later on. Have a good one.